I feel if the jurors simply disregard his confessions, they can't decide if they're true or not. I seriously question whether or not they can arrive at a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. Over 7 years after the brutal slayings of 2 teen girls, jurors will now decide the fate of a man charged with arguably the most notorious murders in Indiana state history. Plus, a North Carolina pastor first came under public scrutiny after the mysterious circumstances surrounding his estranged wife's death. Now the FBI has raided his home and he has been arrested for assault. And the Grammy award-winning rapper at the center of Georgia's longest-running criminal trial takes a mid-trial plea deal offered to him by the judge and walks free. All this and more this week on Courtroom Confidential. It's part of the fun and excitement of covering current, ongoing criminal cases, but by their nature, we are always going to be a little bit behind the curve when it comes to some of this breaking news. We are recording this on Thursday, November 7th of 2024. And as we're doing so, there is the ongoing arguments in the Richard Allen case, ongoing arguments in the Bryan Kohberger case. There are cases that are currently being deliberated by juries, but we are doing our best to give you as much information as up to date as we have it. But let's jump right in. 17 days after it began, defense attorneys for Richard Allen abruptly announced that they had rested their case, marking the end of perhaps the most high-profile murder trial in Indiana state history. This Thursday, the jury will hear one last time from both the prosecution and defense before they are tasked with determining whether or not Allen should be held responsible for the brutal slayings of 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby German near the Mononchai Bridge on February 13th, 2017. While the prosecution called dozens of witnesses testifying to a range of issues from eyewitness testimony of a man matching Allen's description covered in mud and blood close to the time of the murders, to ballistic analysis of an unspent bullet cartridge recovered at the scene that experts have matched to a gun belonging to Allen. Yet in the end, the lion's share of the prosecution's case focused on dozens of alleged confessions made by Allen during his time in custody. The defense countered, arguing that after a year of solitary confinement in Westville Correctional Facility, Allen suffered from severe mental deterioration, which caused him to exhibit bizarre behavior, including eating his own feces and most specifically, making false confessions. Jurors will now hear closing arguments limited to 2.5 hours from each side before beginning their deliberations in this closely followed trial. All right, well, what's happening here? I'm really bothered by this case because at its core, the way that I see it, this comes down to 2 possibilities, and you could argue that they are equally awful. The first is that Richard Allen is an innocent man, driven completely insane by his confinement conditions, to the point that he is willing to confess to murders that he did not commit dozens of times, simply because he felt like he just wanted to end the torture he was experiencing. It's that, or Richard Allen is responsible for 2 of the most heinous and brutal killings that you can possibly imagine, but because he was held in such borderline barbaric conditions, his confessions might now be considered too untrustworthy for the jury, and he may be acquitted. You can see how either one of these are awful. Either one of these are unacceptable. This comes down to a basic problem with this case to begin with, that the evidence supporting his confessions are not what I would consider a slam dunk. Now, it's not nothing. There are eyewitnesses who describe a person matching Allen's description close to the time of the murders, covered in mud and blood, that can place that person matching the bridge guy and matching apparently the clothes that Allen was wearing that day in that same area close to the time of the murders. That's good evidence. There's also this bullet. If the forensic analysis, the ballistic analysis of that bullet can be trusted, that the markings on that cartridge because it was when it was ejected from that gun as an unspent bullet, match his gun owned by Allen. If that can be believed, if that is trustworthy, again, very solid evidence. And then there is his own admission that he makes before he was ever in custody, which places him in that same area close to the times of the murders. That's nothing to dismiss. I'm not trying to say that this case was stitched together with spider thread. What I'm saying is that all of that came into question during the trial. The eyewitness was heavily cross-examined and scrutinized. The bullet ballistic evidence is questionable because it's a little different and groundbreaking than what we're used to seeing. His admissions, yes, place him in that area, but does the timeline all work out? Now, you could argue all of that is sufficient enough to bring an arrest. And maybe you're right. But is it enough to secure a conviction in this case? And that's really the question. Make no mistake, this case hinges on those confessions. That is my honest belief. In other words, I feel if the jurors simply disregard his confessions, they can't decide if they're true or not. I seriously question whether or not they can arrive at a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. I think they have to take those confessions into consideration. I think that they have to believe them. And listen, we're not talking about some offhanded comments that can be construed as some sort of admission of involvement. We're talking black and white confessions. I did this. I killed those girls. I'm responsible. But the defense did a remarkable job of showing the jurors the conditions he was under at that time. Conditions that are unheard of and inexplicable as to why they were occurring. And those conditions, according to their experts, caused this man to essentially devolve into a state of psychosis, which we have evidence of, which there are videos of him in a state of full-fledged psychosis. When you are eating your own feces, I think you've gone past the point of malingering. This is a person who I believe has been proven to this jury is suffering some sort of mental breakdown. Now, did that cause him to falsely confess? And that to me is the central question. If they believe that caused him to falsely confess, I don't know if they can arrive at a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. But if they believe that no, it did not, or perhaps some of it was under his mental duress, but that it can be believed that he was admitting involvement in these murders, then I think that you have a guilty verdict in this case. But it troubles me greatly that this case was brought, because remember, these confessions only take place after he was arrested. It troubles me greatly that what the prosecution decided to bring, arrest this man, charge this man, did not seem tremendously strong until we started to hear about these confessions. But what do you think? Does this case really rise or fall on the confessions? Please let us know in the comments. Seldom does a case capture national attention as quickly as the bizarre circumstances leading to the death of North Carolina woman Mika Miller in April of this year. Miller, age 30 at the time, was found dead in a state park in Robeson County from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, according to local authorities. Mika and her husband, John Paul, or JP, who is the pastor at Solid Rock at Market Common in Myrtle Beach, were estranged at the time of her death. Just over a week before she died, Mika filed for a legal separation. Since that time, Mika's loved ones have speculated that there could have been foul play involved in her death. Theories spread online based on information about the couple's marriage, including a 911 call days before her death, where Mika said she was scared for her life after finding a GPS tracker on her car. However, local authorities have adamantly pushed back, saying evidence of a self-inflicted death were clear and convincing. Then, last week, the FBI conducted an operation at J.P. Miller's Coldwater Circle home in Myrtle Beach, where multiple boxes of evidence were seized. According to JP's lawyer, Russell Long, the FBI executed a search warrant, quote, as expected, adding, nothing new, really. Hopefully this is the end of it. But now JP was arrested on Wednesday after he allegedly confronted a Justice for Mika protester, according to police records. The pastor spent the night in jail and was charged with third-degree assault. He's expected to appear in court for a bond hearing this week and has a court date set for December 10th of 2024. What's happening here? Is any of this related or none at all? That is really the question that a lot of people are asking, and a lot of people have been fascinated in following this case. First question is, why is this case getting so much attention? Well, it has to do with the circumstances of Mika's death. We know that on the day of her death, she went to a pawn shop where she purchased a gun. She was able to walk in and just buy a gun. Later, she makes a 911 call and asks the dispatcher if they are able to track her location. The dispatcher asks her, why? Did something happen? And Mika responds, quote, "I'm about to kill myself, and I just want my family to know where to find me." She then hangs up, and her body is later found. That is bizarre. You have a young, attractive wife of a pastor, bizarre circumstances. Everybody is going to say why. Anytime there's a situation where someone takes their own life, it's always going to raise a lot of questions with people as to why, unless that's completely obvious, unless the surrounding circumstances are so blatantly clear as to what brought that person to that moment of despair. But in a situation like this, a lot of people wondered, and naturally, their suspicions begin to turn towards the husband, the estranged husband. So then add to that, we have this FBI raid. And I got to tell you, the feds are not called into a routine homicide investigation, okay? That rarely happens. They don't have to respond to local authorities when local authorities snap their fingers. It has to be something where the FBI feels there's a reason to employ their resources. There also has to be some sort of jurisdictional hurdle passed. Why is this an FBI problem to begin with? Some local death. But then authorities say it's uninvolved, but they use this term of parallel investigation, which drives me nuts because it's one of those ambiguous, bizarre phrase that makes you wonder, well, what does that mean? If it's unrelated, how is it possibly parallel? But they recovered multiple boxes from his home. So now you have this tragic death, perhaps bizarre circumstances, the subject of suspicion now being raided by the FBI, authorities telling us it's unconnected but parallel, and boxes being recovered from his home. If you're asking me to hedge bets at this point, I would tell you it's probably financially related. That's probably why the FBI would get involved. That's why dozens of boxes might be recovered. Now, I could be dead wrong. I'm just reading the tea leaves as best as anybody at this point because they've been so lacking in their transparency when it comes to this case. But why on earth are you recovering multiple boxes if it's not to investigate some sort of paper-related issue? Okay? And again, it seems like they're going out of their way to say that he has never been a suspect in Mika's death. And then you have this arrest. And it again looks to be unrelated. Wouldn't it be nice, though, if they could just address all of this in a press conference and clear this all up? Perhaps a sprinkling or two of transparency might help out with a deluge of conspiracy that's taking place online and elsewhere. It's a case that I think it's important, as is any case involving public intrigue and someone's death, but it sure would be nice if we knew a little bit more about what's going on instead of having folks like myself just kind of speculate as best that we can. But what do you guys think? Is this just a bunch of highly suspicious yet coincidental circumstances, or do you think these are all somehow connected? Please let us know in the comments. Georgia's longest-running trial in history resumed Monday morning, even after the trial's central figure cut a plea deal last week and was released from jail after more than 2 years behind bars. Judge Paige Reese Whitaker gave new instructions to the jury in Atlanta's YSL RICO trial after several co-defendants, including superstar rapper Young Thug, accepted plea deals and are no longer involved in the judicial proceedings. Young Thug, whose real name is Jeffrey Williams, was released from jail after accepting a non-negotiated plea deal that ended his prosecution. Only two co-defendants remain, Shannon Stillwell, aka SB, and Diamante Kendrick, aka Yak Gotti. Williams received a 40-year prison sentence from Judge Whitaker, who took charge in what had become an unorganized, unruly judicial proceeding. Williams will serve 15 years on probation, and if Williams is successful on his probation, the rest of his sentence will be commuted to time served. Opening statements began in the history-making trial on November 27th of 2023. The trial's jury selection lasted longer than any other in Georgia history, and actual witness testimony itself has also surpassed state records. All right, well, what's going on here? The media and a lot of people covering this have talked about this being a blind deal, meaning the way it's being characterized is that Young Thug and his attorneys felt like they couldn't receive any justice from the prosecution, so they threw themselves at the feet of the judge, begging for mercy and saying, "Judge, we don't care. Whatever you do is going to be more fair than what the prosecution has done. We're going to go ahead and plead guilty and do with us as you will." I will absolutely eat my hat if that's true. What likely took place here is that as negotiations broke down between the prosecution and the defense, and it came down to custody time, he's already been in jail during this entire trial and before then, and he wants out. And the prosecution wasn't willing to give him that. The prosecution says, we want additional time beyond this. We want, I think it was 5 more years beyond this. No deal, not going to do it. The way that this case is broken, and they feel they are in the catbird seat as far as negotiation goes right now. This case is falling apart. It's about to go off the cliff. The judge has been threatening a mistrial. It's largely based on allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. The whole thing's falling apart. We're not going to give you one more day in jail. Okay? That falls apart. No surprise, I think, to anyone, as dug in as both sides are on this. So they turn to the judge and they ask for what we commonly refer to as an indicated, meaning, Judge, just between us, what do you do? If we plead here and we have to plead to the sheet, meaning we'll plead to everything, what do you give him? And I'm sure the judge said, how can we end this? What is the hang up? Custody time? Fine. Now, it may be a devil's bargain for Young Thug because she put him on a tremendously long period of probation, and then she's hanging a sword over his head in suspended time, we call it, of decades in prison, meaning for the next 15 years of his life, Williams has got to walk the straight and narrow, and if he does not, a judge, this judge or another judge, could just enforce that prison time, find him in violation of the terms of his probation, and throw him in jail. Finding somebody in violation of probation, by the way, much, much easier, much lower standard than finding somebody guilty of a crime. Now, I'm not talking about jaywalking. I'm not talking about a traffic ticket. I'm talking about some sort of serious violation of the law. So if this man does not change his life drastically and he violates the law and commits another crime, I could easily see a judge saying, sorry, you had a chance. I gave you a great deal. You're going back to prison, and for a long time. 15 years is a long time to live your life that way, especially when you've been living a lifestyle as Young Thug apparently has. But why did the judge offer this? Because this whole thing was an absolute dumpster fire on wheels and it needed to end. It's an embarrassment at this point. Remember that this whole even beginning of discussions about plea deals came on the heels of yet another prosecutorial blunder where they apparently showed unredacted documents to the jury. The judge threatened a mistrial and then said, you know what? I'm going to take a breather. I'm going to go back to my chambers. I'm going to brew some tea and you guys talk amongst yourselves, knowing that that invites everyone to revisit plea negotiations. Now, you can look at this as either an epic failure on the part of the prosecutors in a case that they brought this huge RICO prosecution and expected to take down Young Thug and all of his associates, Or you can view it as just a triumphant win for the defense, who were able to stay strong for months and years and finally break this whole case down. My view is it's a failure, but it's not because the trial collapsed. It's because it obviously never should have been brought the way that it was in the first place. This case was a monstrosity to begin with. When you really look back of what they were trying to accomplish, it's hubris. It's pride. It was way too big, way too unwieldy, way too much, way too aggressive, and it started to just fall apart. I get asked a lot about how much do questions about resources, and specifically taxpayer money, go into the decisions of prosecutors to pursue a case or not. I get questions a lot where people go, well, don't they see this as just a waste of taxpayer money and won't they just drop it? My answer is no. The answer is no, and the answer is it should be no. You don't want your prosecutors thinking about money problems. You want them thinking about justice and doing the right thing, protecting the people, not making budgetary decisions. But boy, oh boy, when you get a case like this, where it's just an obvious overreach on the part of the prosecution, year-long trial, longest jury selection in state history. When you're breaking records like this that you don't want to break and now the trial's falling apart, you begin to wonder, is this a waste of resources? But what do you guys think? Are the prosecutors to blame for this whole mess, or was this just remarkable lawyering on the part of the defense? Please let us know in the comments. Before we dive into the other cases making headlines this week, I'm going to ask you guys one very small favor, and that is, if you haven't already, please take the time to subscribe to this channel now. If you have, go bug a friend. We are so appreciative of all the response that we've been receiving on this channel, but in order to continue to make it grow and to continue to bring you more content, we need your support, and that is most helpful through your subscription and devotion to this channel. And don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential as a podcast. Join our community on all major podcast platforms. Also making headlines, the wife of a prominent Georgia attorney has been convicted of killing her husband and burning his body. On Monday, a Cherokee County jury found Melody Farris guilty of killing her husband, Gary Farris, an Atlanta area attorney, in 2018. She was convicted on all charges, including murder with malice, felony murder, aggravated assault, concealing the death of another, and making a false statement. The 59-year-old mother of four showed little emotion as the verdicts were read. In July 2018, the couple's son, Scott Farris, discovered Gary's remains on the family's 10-acre farm in Alpharetta, Georgia, in a pile of ashes and called police. Investigators originally believed that Gary suffered a medical emergency and fell into the fire himself. But after the discovery of a bullet lodged in one of Gary's rib bones, his death was declared a homicide. During the trial, prosecutors alleged that the couple had been arguing about money. One of the couple's other children, daughter Emily, testified that her mother had an affair in 2009 and her parents' relationship was under tremendous stress. Meanwhile, Melody's defense alleged that Scott had reason to kill his father and that he often borrowed money from Gary, a point of contention in the family. They also argued that Scott was the only person who owned .38 caliber ammunition, the type of bullet found in Gary's remains, and the only person with the physical strength to have moved Gary's 300-pound frame. After at one point indicating they were deadlocked, the jury ultimately deliberated for over 3 days before finding Melody Farris guilty of all charges. Under Georgia law, the convictions carry a minimum sentence of life in prison. Her sentencing hearing has been scheduled for December. Prosecutors and defense lawyers agree on one thing about Marine veteran Daniel Penny's encounter last year with a distressed, angry, and threatening man on a New York subway. Penny didn't mean to kill him. However, prosecutors told jurors last Friday that Penny went too far in trying to neutralize someone he saw as a threat and not as a person. In response, defense attorney said Penny showed courage and put others' welfare ahead of his own when he placed Jordan Neely in a chokehold that ended with Neely limp on the floor. Prosecutor Daphna Yoren told jurors that case isn't, quote, a referendum on our society's failure to deal with mental illness and homelessness on the subway, nor on police response, or whether Penny had a right to intervene before officers arrived, or even on whether his initial decision to use a chokehold was appropriate. Rather, she said he used far too much force for far too long. He went way too far. If convicted, Penny faces up to 15 years in prison for manslaughter. Trial is expected to last through next week. A South Carolina man is standing trial on charges he killed his wife for setting her on fire, causing her injuries that took her life 10 months later. Craig Anthony Lewis is charged with murder and arson in the death of his wife, Terry Lewis. Police say Craig assaulted his wife over 2 days in January of 2019. According to investigators, Craig hit Terry with personal weapons and the butt of a firearm or shotgun, breaking the weapon over her hip. Terry was bleeding and had trouble walking after the incident. The next day, Craig allegedly lit his wife on fire inside their home in an attempt to kill her. The front of Terry's body suffered severe burns, and she succumbed to her injuries 10 months later. At the time, Craig told investigators his wife accidentally burned herself while trying to light a wood-burning stove at their home. Closing arguments took place Thursday, with the jury deliberating as we make this recording. Mansfield woman Karen Reed's attempt to get some of the criminal charges against her thrown out on the grounds of double jeopardy came before the highest court in Massachusetts on Wednesday. Reed's first trial ended in a mistrial in July when a deadlocked jury failed to reach a verdict. But soon after, her defense said some jurors had come forward to say they had unanimously agreed to acquit Reed on 2 of the 3 charges: the more serious second-degree murder charge and the leaving the scene of a personal injury or death charge. Martin G. Weinberg, an appellate attorney for Reed, said the appeal speaks to core issues, quote, regarding double jeopardy, protections that safeguard defendants, in this case Miss Reed, from re-prosecution for the very same offenses from which a prior jury was discharged without manifest necessity for a mistrial declaration without her consent, adding, the values at stake here are too important. While no decision is expected from the court for months, Norfolk District Attorney Michael Morrissey has vowed to retry Reed on all 3 counts. The second trial is currently scheduled for January, though both sides are seeking to postpone that until April. The man accused of brutally stabbing 4 University of Idaho students will be back in court this week to decide whether or not he will face the death penalty for the murders. In a hearing taking place as we record this, attorneys for Bryan Kohberger hope to have expert witnesses testify and are requesting that the court strike nearly a dozen aspects of the prosecution's quest to have their client put to death if convicted. His team is also challenging the death penalty as a potentially cruel or unusual punishment, arguing that it goes against contemporary standards of decency. Kohberger is accused of killing Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Zaina Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin in a 4 a.m. attack on November 13th of 2022. All 4 were staying in a 6-bedroom home just steps away from the University of Idaho campus. 2 housemates survived the attack, including one who told prosecutors she heard someone crying and saw a masked man leave. Trial is scheduled to begin in August of 2025. Before we get to what's on the docket for next week, I want to take a moment to thank you all for your support. The love from our growing community has been absolutely amazing, but we want to take a moment to give a special shout out to Donna Nethercourt for their glowing review on Apple Podcasts, and to our new members, Samantha Valentine and Kim Delorme, for their kind words on YouTube. Keep them coming, folks. We highly appreciate your feedback. And we would like to know where you are from. We are thrilled by the growth of our international community. On the docket for next week, a year since the death of American hockey player Adam Johnson, whose neck was fatally cut by an opponent's skate during a game in Sheffield, England, Matt Petgrave, who was arrested on manslaughter charges in the death, will be back in a UK court on November 11th to be re-bailed. An Orange County Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Ferguson will be back in court on November 15th to face murder charges in the shooting death of his wife, Cheryl Ferguson, which his lawyer contends was accidental. Authorities said the couple had been arguing in August of 2023, and Ferguson had been drinking when he pulled a pistol from an ankle holster and shot her in the chest. And finally, please join us this Monday for the next installment in our Courtroom Confidential Conversations series featuring Emmy Award-winning lead anchor of Court TV, Vinnie Politan. Join us in the chat at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern for a riveting conversation into his background and journey of one of the most recognizable voices in the true crime space. That is it for us this week, folks. I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I will see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.